The Elegant Collapse. The scent of roasted duck and truffle oil hung in the air, a decadent perfume that seemed to cling to the designer drapes and imported marble of the penthouse. Sarah, in a crimson silk dress that cost more than David's first car, smiled for the camera as a flashbulb popped. Her husband, David, CEO of Ascend Tech, stood beside her, his arm a possessive weight around her waist. They were the epitome of a power couple, young, successful, and perfectly curated for the society pages. Later, as the last of their guests spilled out of the elevator, a soft voice floated from the den. "It's all on me," Lily said, and the sound was like shattered glass. Sarah, her smile still a practiced mask, paused in the hallway. That voice belonged to her little sister, her one true anchor in a sea of ambition. It was the voice of the girl Sarah had shielded from a brutal ex-boyfriend, the one she had helped put through a prestigious art school. And now, that voice was laced with a cooing intimacy Sarah had never heard. Peeking around the corner, she saw them. David and Lily were huddled together on the plush white sofa. Lily's hand was on David's cheek, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "You're under so much pressure, my love," Lily whispered. "I know. But I have a feeling about this. The numbers don't lie. Trust me." It wasn't the touch that sent a jolt of ice through Sarah's veins. It was the words. The numbers don't lie. David had been obsessed with a new high-risk venture, a cryptocurrency platform he'd called Project Phoenix, and had been secretive about the details. He dismissed Sarah's questions, calling her too conservative. Now, here was Lily, a self-proclaimed energy consultant who advised clients based on planetary alignments, whispering about numbers. A horrifying realization dawned on her. Lily wasn't just his mistress, she was his confidant, his partner in crime. David wasn't just cheating, he was trusting her sister with his business, with their future, with everything Sarah had worked to build. The emotional betrayal was a blade, but the financial treachery was a dagger twisted deep into the core of her identity. She retreated, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Built a life with, now a stranger sharing her space. He was engrossed in his phone, a faint smile playing on his lips, a smile she knew wasn't for her. A hollow ache formed in her chest, not from heartbreak, but from the grim understanding that she was mourning a future that had never truly existed. Her plan wasn't born of rage, it was a cold, calculated strategy, like a chess grandmaster mapping out a checkmate. Sarah had a mind for logistics, for finding the weakest point in a system and exploiting it, and the system was her own life. Step 1. Destroy his career. David's success was his identity. Strip that away, and he would be a husk. She knew the underbelly of Ascend Tech better than anyone. As his legal counsel, she had access to every contract, every investor file, every precarious venture he had launched. She started with a secure, untraceable account and began to liquidate small portions of their joint assets. A few shares of Ascend Tech here, a piece of art there. Nothing that would trigger an alarm, but a steady, quiet erosion. Her next move was to find a new ally. She made a discreet phone call to Ethan. Ethan was David's bitter rival, a sharp, ruthless investor who had lost a major deal to David years ago. Their meeting was set for a private, unmarked cafe in the financial district. Ethan arrived with a cynical glint in his eyes. "Sarah," he said without preamble, "I'm surprised you called. Last I heard you were riding high on the Ascend Tech gravy train." Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "The train is derailing," she said, "and I'm looking for a new route. I have intel on Ascend Tech's Project Phoenix. David is overextended and using investor capital for high-risk gambles he can't back up." Ethan's eyes lit up. This wasn't a social call, this was a business proposition. "And what's in it for you?" "I want to see a Centec fall," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. "And I want to make sure David is the one holding the bag. I have access to everything, the data, the contracts, the internal perfect marriage. A perfect setup for the grand reveal." She even spoke to Lily. "Lilybug," she said sweetly over the phone, using the childhood nickname. "I was so impressed with your energy consulting work. I know David really values your input." Sarah feigned genuine curiosity, fishing for details about Lily's intuitive investments and the cosmic alignments that were guiding their financial decisions. Lily, basking in her newfound power, spilled everything, unaware that she was handing Sarah the rope to hang her with. Sarah went to bed that night, not with a sense of relief, but with a quiet satisfaction. The pieces were in place. The game was being played on her terms. The cold vow had been made, and she knew, with an absolute certainty, that she would see it through to the end. The market manipulation. The world, for Sarah, had become a chessboard, and she was moving the pieces with cold, precise intent. She'd spent the weekend in their home office, a fortress of rich mahogany and leather, ostensibly working, but in reality, she was meticulously dismantling David's empire from the inside out. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, executing a series of sell orders. She wasn't just selling their joint stock in a Centec, she was using a dozen shell corporations, a network of legal and financial maneuvers she'd spent years perfecting to make it look like a quiet, industry-driven sell-off. The first domino fell, with an almost imperceptible ripple. A Centec stock, which had been steadily climbing, suddenly flatlined. A few financial journalists wrote it off as market correction. David didn't even notice. He was too busy with Project Phoenix, the ill-fated crypto platform he'd become obsessed with. He'd even set up a new hidden account for its development, a detail Sarah had found buried in a tax file. She used that weakness against him. Sarah, acting as his supportive wife, advised him to pour more of their personal savings into Phoenix, a move she knew would bleed his resources dry. He saw it as a sign of her faith in him. She saw it as a way to hasten his downfall. The next piece of her plan involved Lily. Lily, with her wide, innocent eyes and a voice as soft as velvet, arrived at the penthouse one balance. Sarah listened patiently, her expression a mask of genuine interest. She wrote Lily a check, a large one, and watched as her sister's hands trembled with excitement. Sarah knew that money was gone forever, but she also knew that a paper trail had just been created, linking Lily's fraudulent enterprise directly to their family's finances, a connection Sarah could exploit later. The family dynamics, already strained, became a new front in Sarah's war. At a tense Sunday dinner, Sarah's mother, a woman whose life revolved around appearances and favoring the less stable Lily, criticized Sarah for her workaholism. "You're always so busy, Sarah," she sighed. "Poor David, he must feel so neglected. You should be more like Lily, finding balance and joy." Sarah's smile never wavered, but her words were like razor wire. "I am busy, Mom," she said calmly, "because someone has to be. I'm busy cleaning up messes so that others don't have to live with the consequences. You should be more worried about David and his investments. He's been losing a lot of money." The veiled threat landed perfectly. Her mother's face went pale. The table grew silent. David shot a panicked glance at Sarah, but she just smiled. He knew what she was implying, but he couldn't call her out on it without admitting his failures. He was trapped in her game, and he didn't even know it yet. Non-existent. The public snare. The market turbulence wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow, suffocating fog. A Centech stock price, which had been the shining star of David's career, now felt like a lead weight. At a high-stakes board meeting, David, sweat beading on his brow, tried to spin the numbers. "It's a temporary dip," he insisted, his voice thinner than usual. "Market volatility, we'll ride it out." But the veteran investors around the table, their faces grim, didn't buy it. Sarah watched from the side, a silent observer in a sharp business suit, her face an unreadable mask of professional alignments, of a cosmic oracle guiding her clients to prosperity, and of a divine financial blueprint she was using for her own ventures. Mark, a master of his craft, kept his expression neutral, but his questions grew more pointed, more precise, until Lily, lost in her own hubris, was unknowingly detailing the mechanics of a textbook Ponzi scheme. Just as Mark excused himself with a polite thank you, the main event began. David, at Sarah's urging, was called to the stage to give a toast. He raised his glass, his smile a fragile veneer. "To my beautiful, brilliant wife, Sarah," he announced, his voice booming over the sound system. "She is the rock that holds our world together, the heart of our home, and the soul of my success. I couldn't have done any of this without her." And then it happened. A series of notifications buzzed across the room as phones lit up. Mark Jensen had just published a breaking news story online. The headline was stark: "Cosmic Chaos. Elite Investors Duped by Spiritual Scams." The article detailed a series of high-profile fraudulent schemes, outlining their methods and warning of their increasing prevalence. While it didn't name Lily directly, the details were so specific to her practices that anyone in their circle who had heard her talk would instantly make the connection. David, still on stage, raised his glass again, oblivious to the storm brewing in the palm of everyone's hand. He was lauding the very woman whose latest venture had just been publicly branded as a scam. The irony was exquisite. The crowd, a moment ago so captivated, now exchanged hushed whispers and knowing glances. The cheers for David died down, replaced by a cold, uncomfortable silence. Sarah stood in the front row, a single, solitary figure, her face a serene portrait of elegant composure, watching as her husband unknowingly celebrated his own public and spectacular disgrace. The loss of control. The elegant veneer of David's life began to crack, and her voice calm and soothing. "You're a brilliant man. This is just a setback." To the outside world, Sarah was the picture of the loyal wife, holding her husband's hand as his world fell apart. But behind the scenes, she was a predator, closing in for the kill. She had already arranged for her own law firm, a separate entity she controlled, to represent him in the bankruptcy proceedings. The lawyers were professional and empathetic, but their real loyalty lay with Sarah. Every word David spoke, every detail he shared, every fear he confessed, was dutifully relayed back to her. She wasn't just observing his downfall, she was orchestrating it, using his own words to craft a legal narrative that would leave him with nothing. The tension between David and Lily, once a clandestine spark, now flared into open hostility. Lily, desperate for money after her own schemes unraveled, continued to push her intuitive business ideas, urging David to invest in new, nonsensical ventures. "The stars are shifting, David," she would plead over the phone. "The alignment is perfect for a new venture. We can rebuild everything." One evening, Sarah listened from the other room as David's frustration finally boiled over. "Stop it, Lily. Just stop," he roared. "The stars didn't tell me you were going to scam my investors. The universe didn't tell you to use my money on your stupid crystals and incense. You told me it was a guaranteed win. You're the reason I'm in this mess." The phone call ended with a violent slam. David sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. Sarah walked in slowly, a concerned look on her face. "What happened, darling?" she asked softly, sitting beside him. He looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen. "It's all my fault," he confessed, the words a raw, broken whisper. I was with her. I cheated on you with Lily." Sarah's heart didn't skip a beat. The words didn't sting. She had known this for weeks, and the knowledge had long since lost its power to hurt her. Yet had hurt enough. The truth in David's mind wasn't his doing. It was Lily's insidious fault. He was a victim of circumstance, of an unstable and manipulative woman. This self-serving narrative was all Sarah needed. It gave her the perfect weapon: doubt. She began her new offensive with a series of small, unsettling gestures. David, in his fog of despair, started receiving anonymous text messages from a burner phone. They were innocuous at first. "Remember that night in Bali?" or "Your secret is safe with me." Then they grew more cryptic. "Did you really think she was the one?" And "Some people just lie for a living." David, paranoid and on edge, assumed they were from Lily, a desperate attempt to reconnect. He blocked the number, but the messages continued from a different one, a relentless psychological drumbeat. Sarah, meanwhile, focused her attention on Lily. Lily, stripped of her fake prestige and money, fled to her mother's house, a sprawling, overly decorated estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. She expected sympathy and a financial lifeline. Instead, she found a cold, strategic obstacle in her path. Sarah had beaten her to it. A few days before, Sarah had visited their mother and, with a veneer of concern, explained that Lily was in a very fragile state. "She's been so lost since all of this happened," Sarah had said, her voice filled with feigned sorrow. "The best thing for her right now isn't money or comfort. It's for her to face the reality of what she's done. I've even set her up with a wonderful therapist who specializes in this sort of thing." Sarah's mother, swayed by her daughter's confident, successful demeanor and convinced she was doing the right thing, told Lily she would not be giving her any money. "Sarah is right," she said, her voice uncharacteristically firm. "You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet, dear. Your sister says it's for your own good." Lily, desperate and alone, was crushed, her last safety net cut by the very person she believed was on her side. But Sarah's masterpiece of psychological warfare was yet to come. She began subtly influencing the seeds of destruction she had planted in the financial world were now sprouting in the fragile garden of his mind. And the bitter fruit they would bear was his complete and utter subjugation. The counterattack. David, in his desperate spiral, began to claw at the edges of his paranoia. The anonymous messages and misplaced objects had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, not about Sarah, but about himself. Yet a sliver of his old calculating self remained. A gut feeling, a cold, hard suspicion began to whisper that this was more than just a personal collapse. He remembered Sarah's unusual calmness, her almost surgical precision in handling the chaos. He recalled the look in her eyes at the gala, not of grief, but of a quiet, unholy satisfaction. Driven by this nascent suspicion, he hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Frank, who operated on the fringes of the legal world. Frank was a man of few words and a lot of expensive equipment. David gave him one instruction: find out what Sarah is really doing. Meanwhile, Sarah and Ethan were moving in for the kill. The hostile takeover of Ascend Tech wasn't just about money, it was about public humiliation. Ethan's team, armed with the damning documents Sarah had provided, emails detailing David's use of investor funds for personal gain, and meticulously recorded phone calls where David boasted about his genius plans, were now ready to strike. The final offer was delivered to David's legal team, a laughably low number that was more of an insult than a business proposal. Sarah, acting as David's legal advisor, feigned outrage. "This is a predatory offer, David. We can't accept this." She deliberately stalled the negotiations, knowing that with each passing day, Ascend Tech's value plummeted further. The media, sniffing blood in the water, began to report on the impending takeover, casting David as a failed, reckless leader. The more the press hounded him, the more David clung to Sarah, seeing her as the only person willing to fight for him. The climax of this chapter came with a call from Frank, the private investigator. David answered, his voice a tight coil of anxiety. "What did you find?" Frank's voice was a monotone. "I've been tracking her finances. Nothing. Every transaction is clean, legally compliant. Found nothing." The false trail was so convincing that Frank, a man who prided himself on his work, was completely fooled. David hung up, his hands shaking. He felt a wave of crushing despair. The one person he had dared to suspect, the one person who he thought might be behind it all, was in the clear. His suspicion was just that, suspicion. In a moment of absolute vulnerability and self-loathing, he looked at Sarah, who was sitting across from him pretending to read a book. He saw her as a beacon of unwavering love and loyalty. His suspicion was not a sign of her guilt, but of his own failing mind. He was losing his sanity. The thought terrified him more than losing his fortune. He wasn't just fighting an enemy. He was fighting himself, and he was losing. Unbeknownst to him, Sarah was watching him from the corner of her eye, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. She had just used his own paranoia as a weapon against him, turning his last hope of uncovering her plan into the very proof of his madness. The air in the penthouse, once thick with panic, now held a false, fragile serenity. Sarah had spent days cultivating it, weaving a final, beautiful lie. David, convinced of his own unraveling sanity and Sarah's unwavering devotion, clung to her like a shipwrecked sailor to a piece of driftwood. He saw her as his last hope, his anchor in a world that had gone mad. To solidify this belief, Sarah planned the final act of her charade, a romantic dinner, a private anniversary celebration meant to honor a love that was already long dead. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, the same one she had worn on their first date. She lit candles, arranged a bouquet of their favorite flowers, and played a playlist of the songs from their wedding. David watched her, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic adoration. He believed this was a moment of reconciliation, a chance to start over. He leaned across the table and took her hand. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what I would have done without you. You're the only thing that's real in my life." Being played. That the woman he thought was saving him was actually the one holding the knife. But Lily was a day too late. The dinner was over. The candles had been blown out, their smoke a faint, ghostly wisp in the air. Sarah and David were in the living room, a soft glow illuminating their faces. And then the doorbell rang. It was Lily, a frantic, wild-eyed figure on the other side of the security camera. David, confused, looked to Sarah. She simply smiled, a chillingly calm expression on her face. "Let her in," she said, her voice a calm hum. It's time she learned the truth. Lily burst into the penthouse, her face pale, her hair disheveled. She pointed a trembling finger at Sarah. "She's doing this to you, David! She's the one who's ruining you! She's the one who's behind all of this!" David, caught between two worlds, looked at Sarah, who remained completely still. "Lily, what are you talking about?" he said, his voice laced with confusion. "She's playing you! She's working with Ethan! She has all of the evidence against you. She's trying to get you to confess. Don't you see?" Lily's voice was a desperate shriek, but her words were drowned out by the calm, methodical voice of Sarah. "I know," Sarah said, stepping forward. "She's right, David. I did it. All of it." The words hung in the air, a shocking, brutal confession. Sarah, for the first time, had dropped her mask. The game was over. The showdown had begun. The air in the penthouse had turned to glass, a fragile, brittle thing. Lily's desperate shrieks hung in the silence, her face a mask of frantic fear. David stood frozen, his eyes darting between his two worlds, the desperate, wild-eyed sister and the eerily calm wife who had just confessed to everything. Sarah, however, didn't flinch. She simply walked over to the sound system and turned the volume down on the song "Lie to Me," to our friends, to our family. She clicked the remote again. The screen now displayed a series of documents, emails, wire transfer requests, legal contracts. "These are the files that detail your investments in Project Phoenix. You used company funds, diverted money from our joint accounts, and committed wire fraud. The police would call that grand larceny. The shareholders will call it a class action lawsuit." Lily, in a panic, stammered, But the money, you said you would pay me." Sarah turned to her, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "I did pay you, Lily. I paid you with a one-way ticket to Paris and a wad of cash that you were supposed to use to disappear. But I see you've chosen to stay. That's a shame, because now you can watch what happens when you don't play by the rules." David's world was collapsing around him in a whirlwind of cold facts and digital evidence. He stared at the screen, at the irrefutable proof of his own undoing. Sarah was the puppet master, and he and Lily had been her unwitting puppets. Sarah finally stepped forward, her eyes fixed on David. "I'm not here for your confession, David. I'm here for my divorce." She picked up a manila envelope from the table and placed it in his limp hand. "Everything is in there. The divorce papers, a restraining order, and a legal notice that, as of this moment, you no longer have access to any of our shared assets. I've already signed my name. You have 24 hours to do the same." She had not only taken his money and his business, she had also taken his pride, his dignity, and his ability to see himself as a good man. The look on his face was not one of rage, but of utter, soul-crushing defeat. He had lost everything, and he had done so at the hands of the woman he had betrayed. The perfect picture of their marriage was shattered, revealing a masterpiece of cold, elegant revenge. The $1 million divorce. The following days were a blur of cold, sterile formalities. The lavish penthouse, once a stage for their perfect life, became the setting for David's personal crucifixion. He signed the divorce papers, his hand trembling, the ink on the page a permanent mark of his ruin. The terms were brutally clear. It screamed. The articles painted a picture of a man who had squandered a fortune and a woman who had, with a fierce, quiet dignity, taken back what was hers. Sarah was hailed as a brilliant, wronged heroine, a woman who had a cold, elegant brand of justice, but David, in his stupor of defeat, had one final pathetic ace up his sleeve. During his frantic, panicked calls to his legal team, he had been recording every conversation on an old, outdated USB drive he had kept hidden in the safe. The recordings captured his lawyers' hushed, leading questions and their subtle manipulation of his words, proving that they were in on the scheme. It was a flimsy piece of evidence, a Hail Mary pass from a man who had already lost the game, but it was enough to incriminate Sarah's entire plot. He had it all, right there on the USB. Proof that she had engineered his downfall. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't want to go public. He just wanted a piece of his old life back. The money, the status, the recognition. He just wanted something to bargain with. He had a weapon, and he was going to use it to get back at her. And in her moment of victory, as she sat alone in the now silent penthouse, a faint, disquieting whisper of unease prickled at Sarah. A single fleeting thought, a shard of suspicion pierced her fortress of triumph. Something was missing. She had secured every asset, every bank account, every piece of documentation, but a small detail, a minor discrepancy in an old financial file, suggested that David had managed to squirrel away one last thing. A single, insignificant piece of data she couldn't find. A final, hidden secret that had escaped her grasp. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that David was still holding a card, and that her victory, so perfectly executed, was not yet complete. The false peace. The months that followed were a testament to Sarah's ruthlessness and resilience. She was a phoenix rising from the ashes of her own making, a celebrated figure in the financial press. She was lauded not just for her business acumen, but for her quiet strength in the face of public scandal. She was the woman who had lost everything and won it all back, a modern-day legend. She had sold the penthouse, but the peace was a delicate illusion, a fragile truce in a war that wasn't truly over. One afternoon, a package arrived at her new office. It was from David. Inside, there was no letter, no plea for help. There was only a small, cheap USB drive. The label on it was a single word, handwritten in his messy scrawl. Proof. A cold dread coiled in Sarah's stomach. She slid the drive into her computer. The folders were neatly organized, each one labeled with a date and a description. David, call W, lawyer, 10/23/25. Email W, Ethan, Apprise merger. Recording of Sarah and as Cosby confrontation. It was everything. Every call, every conversation, every whisper of her plot had been captured, a detailed, incriminating record of her entire revenge plan. He had been recording everything, from the moment he had first suspected her. The phone rang. It was David. His voice, once broken and pleading, now held a chilling new confidence. "I'm not asking for money, Sarah," he said, his words a slow, measured threat. "I'm asking for a piece of our life back. The money you took from me, the status, the recognition. I want a deal, and I want it now." The betrayal from her own lawyers, a detail she had not considered, was a devastating blow. She had controlled every variable, every outcome, or so she had thought. But in his moment of greatest weakness, David had done something brilliant, and now he had the leverage. Suddenly, Sarah's mind turned to Ethan. He was a master of his own conspiracies, a man who had benefited immensely from her actions. A cold, unsettling thought began to form in her mind. What if he had known about the recordings? What if he had been playing a long game, a game in which she was just another piece to be moved? The perfect life she had so carefully constructed began to feel like a house of cards, built on a foundation of betrayal and lies, with a secret enemy lurking somewhere in the shadows. The reckoning. The truth, once a vague suspicion, now hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. The USB drive in her hand was a ticking time bomb, and David was holding the detonator. The phone call had been a clear ultimatum. He wanted to be made whole. He didn't want revenge anymore. He just wanted his old life. Us. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She saw a tiny detail in his evasion, a minute crack in his perfect facade. She had studied him for years, both as a rival and as a partner, and she knew a lie when she heard one. She pushed further, her questions like a surgeon's scalpel. He was the one who had introduced her to the lawyers who had compromised David. He was the one who had insisted she use a shell company for the initial transactions, and he was the one who had so perfectly positioned himself to acquire a Centec at a rock-bottom price. Ethan hadn't just helped her. He had used her to eliminate his rival, and he had done it so masterfully that she hadn't even seen it coming. She walked out of the restaurant without a word. She knew exactly what she had to do. The game wasn't over. It had just entered its final, most brutal phase. The next day, she met David in a quiet public park. He was a shell of the man he once was, his suit rumpled, his eyes haunted. He handed her the USB drive, a victory she didn't want. She took it, but instead of making a deal, she simply looked him in the eye. "I'm sorry, David," she said, and for the first time she meant it. "I'm sorry you were so weak. I'm sorry you believed her lies. But I'm not sorry for what I did. You brought this on yourself." She walked away, leaving him standing there, a ghost of his former self. She had his leverage, but she didn't use it against him. She used it against the real enemy. Sarah sent the USB drive to a friend in law enforcement, along with an anonymous tip about a series of complex financial crimes, the crimes she had committed herself. She hadn't just been a victim, she had been a criminal, and she knew that the only way to truly win was to destroy all the evidence, including herself. The recordings on the USB were not just of her, they were of Ethan, of her lawyers, of the entire conspiracy. By giving them up, she was sacrificing herself, but she was also ensuring that everyone else went down with her. A week later, headlines screamed the news. Wall Street power couple, and she had done it by sacrificing a small part of herself. She had tasted revenge, and it was cold and sweet, but in the end, it was a bitter, lonely meal. She sat alone in a small, quiet house, with no one to share her victory with. She had fought for her life, and she had won, but she had done it alone. And in the end, that was the most brutal consequence of all.